The sun hung low over the Arizona territory, painting the red rock formations in shades of copper and rust. Dust devils danced across the barren landscape, swirling through the streets of Cedar Ridge, a town that clung to existence at the edge of nowhere. The year was 1873, and the desert's thirst seemed to seep into everything: the cracked earth, the weathered wood of storefronts, and the souls of those who called this harsh land home. Margaret Sullivan stood at her bedroom window, watching the town below through lace curtains her mother had brought from Boston. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that seemed out of place in this rugged frontier: porcelain skin that her father insisted she protect with parasols and bonnets, chestnut hair always pinned in proper Eastern fashion, and green eyes that held a restlessness no amount of etiquette lessons could tame. "Margaret, dear, step away from that window," her mother called from downstairs. "A lady doesn't gawk at the street like a common shop girl." But Margaret couldn't help herself. From her vantage point in the mayor's residence, the finest house in Cedar Ridge, built of imported lumber and real glass windows, she could see the entire main street: the saloon with its bat-wing doors, the general store where Mrs. Henderson gossiped with anyone who'd listen, the church with its modest steeple, and beyond it all, the vast expanse of desert and mountains that seemed to promise something more than the suffocating propriety of her daily life. 3 miles outside town, at the Broken Spur Ranch, Jake Morrison was breaking his back under the scorching sun. Sweat soaked through his worn cotton shirt as he hefted another bale of hay into the barn. At 28, he had the lean, hard muscle that came from years of honest work, hands calloused and scarred, skin bronzed by endless days under the western sun. His past cast a shadow longer than any desert afternoon, 5 years prior. He'd ridden with the Colton gang, young and foolish and desperate. A botched robbery in Tucson had landed him in Yuma prison for 3 years. Now, released and trying to walk the straight path, he found that redemption was harder to grasp than a fistful of desert sand. Morrison, old Pete, the ranch foreman, called out, "That's enough for today. You've done the work of 2 men again." Jake nodded, wiping his brow with his sleeve. He knew old Pete was one of the few in town who'd given him a chance, who saw beyond the mark of an ex-convict. The pay was meager, barely enough to rent a small shack near the dried riverbed, but it was honest work. That had to count for something. As twilight descended, painting the sky in purples and oranges that only the desert could produce, Jake made his way to the riverbed. Though the river had run dry years ago, leaving only smooth stones and memories of water, there was a small spring hidden among the cottonwoods that still trickled with precious water. It was his secret place, where he could wash away the day's dust and briefly forget the weight of judgment that followed him through town. Margaret had discovered the spring by accident months ago, during one of her rebellious evening escapes. Her father would be furious if he knew she ventured out alone after dark, but the walls of their proper home felt like they were closing in more each day. Her mother's constant talk of arranging a suitable marriage, preferably to Harold Whitmore, the railroad money heir who visited quarterly, made her feel like a prize horse being readied for auction. On this particular evening, with her parents attending a social gathering at the banker's home, Margaret slipped out through the kitchen door. She'd traded her cumbersome day dress for a simpler calico frock she'd hidden for such occasions, though even this concession to practicality would scandalize her mother. The desert air felt like freedom against her skin as she made her way along the familiar path. The moon was just rising, full and bright enough to cast shadows among the cottonwoods, when she heard it, the splash of water and a low, hummed melody. Margaret froze, her heart racing. Someone else knew about her sanctuary. Jake was knee-deep in the small pool, his shirt draped over a nearby branch, washing the day's grime from his arms and face. The melody, an old cowboy ballad his father had taught him before whiskey claimed him, died on his lips as he sensed another presence. He turned slowly, water dripping from his hair, and found himself staring into the greenest eyes he'd ever seen. For a moment, neither moved. The desert night held its breath around them. Margaret knew she should run, Scream. Do something other than stand there staring at this half-dressed stranger. But something in his eyes, a mixture of surprise, wariness, and an unexpected gentleness, kept her rooted in place. "Miss Sullivan," Jake said finally, his voice rough. He'd seen her in town. Of course, everyone knew the mayor's daughter. But seeing her here, moonlight catching in her hair, without the armor of social position between them, she looked entirely different, more real, more alive. "You know who I am," Margaret said, finding her voice. It wasn't a question. "Everyone knows who you are." Jake reached for his shirt, suddenly conscious of his state. "I'll leave. This is your place." "It's not mine," Margaret said quickly, surprising herself. "The spring belongs to no one. Or everyone." She paused, then added with a hint of defiance, "Besides, you were here first tonight." Jake pulled on his shirt, fingers fumbling with the buttons. He should leave. Being found alone with the mayor's daughter would be worse than any crime in his past. But something in the way she stood there, chin lifted, a challenge in her eyes despite the very real risk to her reputation, made him hesitate. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "It's dangerous." Margaret almost laughed. "More dangerous than being slowly suffocated in that house. More dangerous than being sold off to the highest bidder who can offer my father political advantages." The bitterness in her voice surprised them both. Jake studied her face in the moonlight, seeing past the careful facade for the first time. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "What did you expect?" A pampered Eastern flower who'd faint at the sight of a working man's hands. He held up his calloused palms, half in jest, half in challenge. This time Margaret did laugh, a sound like water in the desert. "And you're not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" She met his gaze directly. "A dangerous outlaw who'd rob me and leave me for dead." Jake flinched. So she knew. Of course she knew. "I'm not that man anymore," he said quietly. "No," Margaret agreed, studying his face. "I don't think you are." They stood there in the moonlight, the spring gurgling softly between them, and something shifted in the air. It was as if the desert itself recognized this moment, two souls from different worlds, finding each other in the margins where society's rules grew thin. "I should go," Margaret said, but made no move to leave. "So should I," Jake agreed, equally motionless. A coyote howled in the distance, breaking the spell. Margaret took a step backward, then paused. "Do you come here often? To the spring?" "Most evenings, after work." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Perhaps we'll meet again then." "By accident, of course." "Of course," Jake agreed, his own smile answering hers. Margaret turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving Jake standing by the spring, his heart pounding harder than it had during any robbery. He knew he should stay away, that nothing good could come from whatever had just sparked between them. But as he watched her disappear into the night, he already knew he'd be back tomorrow. And the night after that, in the days that followed, the spring became their secret. Neither acknowledged the deliberateness of their meetings, maintaining the fiction of chance encounters. They would talk, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. Margaret spoke of books she'd read, dreams of seeing the world beyond Cedar Ridge's dusty borders. Jake shared stories of the trail, the beauty of sunrise over the mountains, the freedom of a life unbound by society's expectations. "Why did you do it?" Margaret asked one night, brave enough finally to voice the question. "The robberies. I mean..." Jake was quiet for a long moment, skipping stones across the small pool. "Hunger, mostly. Desperation. My PA died when I was 15, left nothing but debts. Ma took sick the next winter. Medicine cost money we didn't have." He threw another stone, harder this time. "Doesn't excuse it. Nothing excuses it. But when you're watching your mother die and someone offers you a way to save her, you don't always make the right choice." Margaret reached out, almost touched his hand, then pulled back. Even here, in their secret world, some boundaries remained. "Did you save her?" "No." The word carried years of regret. Got arrested 2 weeks later. She died while I was awaiting trial. Alone. This time, Margaret did touch him, her fingers briefly covering his scarred knuckles. I'm sorry. Jake turned his hand palm up, catching her fingers for just a moment before letting go. Don't be. It was my choice, my consequences to bear. But as they continued to meet, night after night, both began to realize that consequences had a way of spreading like ripples in water. The careful distance they maintained in town, the averted gazes, the wide berths when passing on the street, became harder to sustain. Margaret found herself watching for him from her window, her heart leaping at the sight of his familiar figure heading to the ranch. Jake caught himself lingering in town longer than necessary, hoping for a glimpse of her. The desert watched their growing attachment with ancient indifference, keeping their secret among the cottonwoods and stars. But secrets in a small town are like water in the desert, precious, rare, and impossible to hold forever. Summer gave way to autumn in the Arizona territory, though the change was subtle, the scorching heat mellowing to a dry warmth, the sunsets arriving earlier to paint the mountains in deeper shades of crimson. The secret meetings by the spring had evolved from chance encounters to an unspoken ritual, each nightfall bringing Margaret and Jake together like the moon pulling the tide. On this particular October evening, Jake arrived at the spring to find Margaret already there, sitting on a flat boulder with her shoes beside her, bare feet dangling in the cool water. The sight of her, unguarded, natural, free from the constraints of proper society, made his breath catch. "You're early," he said, settling beside her on the rock, careful to maintain a respectable distance. "Father had another tedious dinner with the town council. Mother's entertaining the wives with talk of the harvest dance." Margaret's voice carried a weariness that went bone deep. I couldn't breathe in that house another moment. They sat in companionable silence, watching the first stars emerge. In the months since their first meeting, these silences had become as comfortable as their conversations, spaces where words weren't needed, where simply existing together was enough. "Tell me about the wild horses," Margaret said suddenly. "The mustangs you mentioned seeing in the northern valleys." Jake smiled, recognizing her need to escape, if only through stories. "They run like the wind itself," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a natural storyteller. "Manes streaming, hooves barely touching earth. There's a stallion up there, coat black as midnight, with a white star on his forehead. The vaqueros call him Estrella Negra, Black Star. They say he's uncatchable, that he knows every canyon and gulch better than any man alive." "Have you tried to catch him?" "Once." Jake's hand unconsciously moved to his ribs, remembering. "Got 3 broken ribs and a concussion for my trouble. But for one moment, one perfect moment, I had my rope on him, looked him right in the eye. And I swear, Margaret, he was laughing at me." Margaret's laughter rang out, genuine and unrestrained. "I would have loved to see that, the great Jake Morrison, bested by a horse." "Not just any horse," Jake protested, grinning. "That Mustang has more spirit than half the men in this territory." "I wish I could see them," Margaret said, her laughter fading to something more wistful. "The wild horses, the valleys, any of it. Why can't you?" She gave him a look that said he should know better. "Young ladies don't go gallivanting through the wilderness. We sit in parlors and practice embroidery and wait for suitable husbands to claim us." The mention of husbands cast a shadow over the evening. They both knew Harold Whitmore was due back in town soon, that Margaret's father was growing impatient with her resistance to the match. "You could learn to ride," Jake said carefully. "Properly. I mean, not the side saddle nonsense they teach Eastern ladies." Margaret turned to him, eyes bright with sudden interest. "Would you teach me?" Every rational part of Jake's mind screamed no. Teaching the mayor's daughter to ride would mean spending more time together. Daylight time, where they could be seen. But looking at the hope in her eyes, he heard himself saying, "There's an old line shack about 5 miles north, near Juniper Creek. No one uses it anymore. If you could get away in the early mornings." "Yes," Margaret said instantly. "Yes, I'll find a way." And so their secret world expanded. 3 mornings a week, Margaret would slip out before dawn, telling her mother she was taking early walks for her constitution. Jake would meet her with 2 horses, his own reliable paint, Dusty, and a gentle mare he'd been training at the ranch. The first lesson was a disaster. Margaret, used to the passive perch of a side saddle, found the western saddle foreign and ungainly. She slid off 3 times before they even left a walk, each fall punctuated by very unladylike language that made Jake bite back laughter. "It's not funny," she huffed, brushing dust from her borrowed trousers. Another scandal, wearing her late brother's old clothes she'd hidden in the barn. "You're right," Jake agreed solemnly, then ruined it by adding, "It's hilarious." She threw a handful of dirt at him, missing widely, and suddenly they were both laughing, the tension breaking like a summer storm. But Margaret was nothing if not determined. Within weeks, she was riding with growing confidence, her natural grace translating to an intuitive understanding of the horse's movements. Jake taught her everything: how to read the land, watch for rattlesnakes, find water in dry country. More than riding, he was teaching her survival, though neither spoke of why she might need such skills. Their morning rides became explorations of hidden Arizona. Jake showed her ancient cliff dwellings tucked into canyon walls, their origins lost to time. They discovered a field where wildflowers bloomed despite the arid soil, purple lupines and golden poppies creating an impossible carpet of color. Once, they came upon a family of javelinas, the wild pigs snorting indignantly before crashing away through the brush. "This is freedom," Margaret breathed one morning, as they paused atop a ridge overlooking the vast expanse of desert and mountain. The sunrise painted everything in shades of gold and rose. "This feeling, right here, this is what I've been missing my whole life." Jake watched her, cheeks flushed from the ride, hair escaping from her practical braid, eyes alive with joy, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. He'd been fooling himself, thinking he could keep this casual, controlled. Somewhere between the first riding lesson and this moment, he'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love with Margaret Sullivan. "Jake?" She'd turned to find him staring. "What is it?" He should lie, should make some excuse about checking the horses. Instead, he found himself saying, "You're beautiful like this, real, not the China doll they try to make you be in town, but this." The words hung between them like a challenge. Margaret's breath caught, her eyes widening. Then, with a courage that surprised them both, she guided her horse closer to his, close enough that their knees touched. "Jake Morrison," she said softly, "are you sweet-talking the mayor's daughter?" "Maybe I'm sweet-talking the woman who can outride half the cowboys in the territory," he replied, voice rough with emotion. "Only half. Give it another month." She laughed, but it trembled at the edges. "Jake, A gunshot in the distance made them both freeze. Jake's hand went automatically to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, every muscle tense. But it was followed by whooping and laughter, just cowboys from a neighboring ranch, probably shooting at bottles. The spell was broken, reality crashing back. They were not free souls in the wilderness. They were the convict and the mayor's daughter, stealing moments that could destroy them both. "We should head back," Margaret said quietly. The ride back was subdued, each lost in thought. As they neared the line shack where they always parted ways, Jake spoke the words that had been burning in him for weeks. Their secret love exposed. The town would hunt them while his passion kept her alive. Margaret pulled up sharply, staring at him. "What did you say?" "Something my mother used to say, about a story her grandmother told, about a Spanish soldier and a native woman, back when this was all New Spain. Their peoples were enemies, but they loved each other anyway. When their secret was discovered, both sides hunted them into the mountains." He paused, meeting her eyes. "She said love like that, love that defies everything. It's the only thing strong enough to keep you alive when the whole world turns against you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly he almost missed it, she said, "Do you believe that? That love can be that strong, I'm starting to, Jake admitted. That night at the spring, things were different. The awareness that had been building for months was impossible to ignore. They sat closer on their familiar rock, shoulders touching, hands almost brushing. Margaret told him about the latest letter from Harold Whitmore, how her father was already planning their engagement announcement for Christmas. "I can't marry him," she said fiercely. "I won't. I'd rather die an old maid than spend my life in a loveless marriage, bearing children for a man who sees me as nothing more than a pretty possession and a political connection." "Your father won't give you a choice," Jake said, hating the truth of it. "Then I'll run away." "To where? With what money? Margaret, you've never lived rough, never gone hungry, never—" "Then teach me," she interrupted, turning to face him fully. "You've been teaching me to ride, to read the land. Teach me to survive, just in case." The unspoken hung between them, just in case we need to run together. It was madness. It was impossible. It was inevitable. "Margaret," Jake began, but she pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't tell me all the reasons this is foolish. I know them all. I recite them to myself every night. But Jake, when I'm with you, I can breathe. When I'm with you, I'm myself. Not the mayor's daughter, not anyone's future wife, just Margaret." Jake caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "And I'm just Jake, not the ex-convict, not the man with no future, just Jake. Just Jake and just Margaret," she repeated. "Why can't that be enough?" Under the stars, beside the whispering spring, with coyotes calling in the distance. Jake pulled her into his arms for the first time. She came willingly, fitting against him like she'd always belonged there. They didn't kiss, that last line not yet crossed, but held each other with desperate tenderness, as if they could stop time through sheer force of will. But time, like water in the desert, flowed on regardless, and with each passing day, their secret love grew stronger, deeper, and more dangerous. The town continued its daily rhythms, unaware of the storm building in its midst. Harold Whitmore's arrival was only weeks away, and with it, decisions that would shatter their careful, hidden world. As Jake held Margaret under the vast Arizona sky, he thought of his mother's story, of love hunted through the mountains. He pressed his lips to her hair and made a silent promise. Whatever came, whatever the cost, his love would keep her alive, even if it meant his own destruction. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge above, or the satisfied smile that played across jealous lips. Chester Williams, the sheriff's deputy who'd been sweet on Margaret since childhood, had finally found what he'd suspected for weeks. By tomorrow, their secret would be secret no more. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Chester Williams strode into the Silver Dollar Saloon, his boots striking the wooden floor with purposeful rhythm. The saloon was nearly empty at this hour, just a few early drinkers and Carl the bartender wiping down glasses. Chester's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, well," he announced to the room at large. "Seems our proper Miss Margaret Sullivan ain't so proper after all." The effect was immediate. Heads turned. Conversations died. In a town starved for scandal. Chester's words were like throwing meat to wolves. "What's that supposed to mean?" Carl asked, though his eager expression showed he very much wanted to know. Chester settled at the bar, making them wait, savoring his moment. "Saw something mighty interesting last night by the old Cottonwoods. The mayor's precious daughter keeping company with Jake Morrison." He paused for effect. "Real close company, if you catch my meaning." The silence exploded into chaos. Men talking over each other, theories spinning wilder with each telling. Within an hour, the story had spread to the general store, where Mrs. Henderson clutched her pearls and declared she'd always known that girl had too much spirit. By noon, it had reached the church, where Reverend Pritchard shook his head sadly and spoke of fallen women and the devil's temptations. Margaret first sensed something was wrong when she entered the millinery shop that afternoon. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Mrs. Appleby, who had always greeted her warmly, suddenly found urgent business in the back room. The other ladies present, wives of merchants and ranchers, drew their skirts aside as she passed, as if her very presence might contaminate them. "Is something wrong?" Margaret asked, trying to maintain her composure. "I think you know very well what's wrong, Miss Sullivan," replied Mrs. Davies, the banker's wife, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Though I must say, we're all shocked. Your poor mother." Margaret's blood ran cold, but she kept her chin high. "I'm afraid I don't understand. Don't you, Mrs.?" Davies' smile was sharp as a blade. "Perhaps you should ask Jake Morrison, though I suppose you already know him quite well." Margaret fled the shop, her mind racing. How? How had they found out? She'd been so careful, so discreet. But in a town like Cedar Ridge, secrets were currency, and someone had finally cashed in theirs. At the mayor's residence, she found her worst fears confirmed. Her father stood in his study like a gathering storm, her mother weeping on the settee. "Margaret!" Her father's voice was deadly quiet. "Sit down." "Father, Sit down!" Margaret had never heard him roar like that. She sank into a chair, hands clasped to stop their trembling. "Is it true?" her mother whispered through her tears. "Have you been meeting with that criminal?" "Jake Morrison is not a criminal," Margaret said firmly. "He paid his debt to society. He's a good man who made mistakes in his youth." "A good man?" Her father's laugh was bitter. "A good man who's destroyed your reputation, ruined your prospects, made us the laughingstock of the entire territory. We've done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" Mayor Sullivan swept the papers off his desk in rage. "You've been sneaking out like a common harlot, meeting a convict in secret. God knows what else." "Stop it!" Margaret shot to her feet. "You don't know him. You don't know anything about who he really is." "I know enough," her father said coldly. "I know that by tomorrow, everyone in the territory will know that my daughter has been consorting with an ex-convict. I know that Harold Whitmore will withdraw his interest the moment he hears. I know that you've destroyed everything we've built here." "Good." Margaret's own anger flared. "I never wanted to marry Harold Whitmore. I never wanted any of this. The pretense, the politics, the prison you call proper society." Her mother gasped. "Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan, how dare you? How dare I?" Margaret whirled on her. "How dare I want to choose my own life? How dare I fall in love with someone who sees me as more than a bargaining chip?" "Love?" Her father's voice was dangerous. "You think this is love? You're a child playing with fire, and you're about to burn this whole family down." "Then let it burn." The slap came so fast, Margaret didn't see it coming. Her mother's hand connected with her cheek, the crack echoing through the study. They all froze, equally shocked. Her mother had never raised a hand to her before. "You will go to your room," her father said, his voice like ice. "You will not leave this house. Tomorrow. We'll decide what's to be done with you. There are convents back east, places for wayward girls." "I'm not a wayward girl," Margaret said quietly, holding her stinging cheek. "I'm a woman who's made her choice." "Then you're no daughter of mine." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret looked between her parents, her father's face set in stone, her mother's crumpled with grief, and knew there would be no forgiveness here, no understanding, no love that wasn't conditional on her obedience. She turned and walked from the room with as much dignity as she could muster. But once in the hallway, she ran, up the stairs, into her room, slamming the door behind her. She could hear her mother's renewed sobs, her father's voice raised in anger, giving orders to the servants. Meanwhile, at the Broken Spur Ranch, Jake was experiencing his own reckoning. Sheriff Daniels himself had ridden out, flanked by 2 deputies, their faces grim. "Jake Morrison," the sheriff said. Not unkindly. He'd always been fair, even to ex-convicts. "We need to talk. Sheriff." Jake set down the bridle he'd been mending. Already knowing what this was about, the other ranch hands had been giving him strange looks all morning. "You know why I'm here, son. I can guess." Sheriff Daniels sighed, removing his hat to wipe his brow. I've got half the town ready to form a lynch mob. The other half wants you run out on a rail. Mayor Sullivan. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The mayor's talking about pressing charges. For what? Jake's voice was steady, though his heart hammered. Talking to his daughter. Last I checked, that wasn't a crime. Don't play games with me. Boy, you know what this is about. A man like you, with your history, carrying on with a respectable girl. Margaret Sullivan is more than respectable. Jake interrupted. She's the finest woman I've ever known. That may be, the sheriff allowed. But it doesn't change facts. You're an ex-convict. She's the mayor's daughter. This can only end one way, and you know it. Old Pete had approached during the conversation, standing silent support behind Jake. Sheriff, Jake's been nothing but honest and hard-working since he came here. Whatever's between him and the girl, it ain't no crime. Maybe not in the law books, Sheriff Daniels said. But there's law, and then there's justice. At least how this town sees it. He fixed Jake with a hard stare. I'm giving you a choice. Morrison, leave town tonight, quiet-like. Head to California, Mexico, wherever, or stay and face what's coming. And son, what's coming ain't gonna be pretty. Jake met his gaze steadily. What about Margaret? Miss Sullivan ain't your concern anymore. The hell she isn't. The sheriff's hand moved to his gun belt. Not a threat, just a reminder. Don't make this worse than it is. You've got till sundown to decide. After they left, Jake stood in the barn, fists clenched, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to ride to Margaret immediately. But that would only make things worse. He needed to think, to plan. You gonna run? Old Pete asked quietly. Would you? Pete spat tobacco juice into the hay. Depends. She worth fighting for? Yes. Then there's your answer. As the afternoon wore on, Cedar Ridge transformed from a sleepy frontier town to a powder keg. Men gathered in the saloon, voices growing louder with each whiskey. Talk of defending the town's honor, of teaching lessons, of making examples. Chester Williams held court, embellishing his story with each telling until it was barely recognizable. In the church, a different gathering formed, women clutching their Bibles, praying for Margaret's soul while secretly delighting in the fall of someone who'd always been a little too proud, a little too different. Reverend Pritchard tried to preach calm. Judge not, lest ye be judged, he reminded them, but his words fell on deaf ears. That Morrison boy corrupted her, insisted Mrs. Davies. Led her astray with his outlaw ways. The girl always had wild blood, countered Mrs. Henderson. Remember how she used to climb trees in her Sunday dress? This is what comes of educating women, declared Mr. Thornton, the bank manager, filling their heads with ideas. As shadows lengthened toward evening, Mayor Sullivan called an emergency meeting of the town council. The assembled men, merchants, landowners, those who considered themselves the pillars of Cedar Ridge, gathered in the town hall with faces like a jury at a hanging. Gentlemen, the mayor began, his voice controlled despite the fury burning in his eyes. We have a situation that threatens the very moral fabric of our community. What do you propose, Sullivan? Asked Judge Carter, the only actual legal authority present. The law may be limited, but community justice is not. Morrison must go. Tonight, and my daughter. He paused, struggling with the words. My daughter must be made to understand the consequences of her actions. And if Morrison refuses to leave, Mayor Sullivan's face was stone, then we make him. The vote was unanimous, as the council dispersed to gather men for what everyone carefully didn't call a lynch mob. Chester Williams slipped away with a satisfied smile. He'd waited years for a chance at Margaret Sullivan, watching her reject every suitable man who courted her. If he couldn't have her, he'd make damn sure no one else could either, especially not some reformed outlaw who wasn't fit to shine her shoes. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky the color of blood, two hearts prepared for what was coming. In her locked room, Margaret packed a small bag with essentials, her hands steady despite the tears on her cheeks. She'd made her choice at the spring months ago, perhaps that very first night. Now it was time to live with it, or die with it. At the line shack north of town, Jake loaded his rifle and checked his revolver. He wouldn't run, not this time. He'd run from his mistakes before, run from his mother's death, run from the man he'd been, but he wouldn't run from love, not from Margaret. The storm was coming. By morning, blood would stain the Arizona dust, and two souls would discover whether love truly could keep them alive when the whole world turned against them. In the distance, a coyote howled. Lonely, defiant, free. It was answered by another, then another, until the night filled with their wild song. And in that chorus, both Margaret and Jake heard the same truth. Some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. The hunt was about to begin. The moon was a silver sliver in the sky when Margaret slipped from her bedroom window, using the trellis she'd climbed as a child. Her small bag was strapped across her back, her brother's old clothes allowing her to move freely. The house was quiet, her father at the town hall organizing his vigilantes, her mother sedated with laudanum after her hysteria. She'd left a note on her pillow, simple and final. I choose love over fear. Don't look for me. Jake was saddling Dusty when he heard the soft whinny. His hand went to his gun, then relaxed as Margaret emerged from the shadows, leading the mare they'd trained together. You shouldn't be here, he said, even as his heart leaped at the sight of her. Neither should you, she countered. The whole town's gathering. They'll be here within the hour. I know. Jake continued checking his saddle, his movements calm despite the urgency. That's why you need to go home. Margaret, tell them I forced you, threatened you. Stop! She moved to him, placing her hand over his on the saddle horn. We both know I can't go back. Not now, not ever. This isn't some romantic adventure, Jake said harshly, trying one last time to save her from his fate. We'll be hunted like animals. You've never gone hungry, never slept in the cold, never— Margaret silenced him with a kiss, their first and possibly last. It was desperate and tender and tasted of tears and determination. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. I know what I'm choosing, she whispered against his lips. I choose you. I choose us. Now are we going to stand here arguing until they arrive, or are we going to ride? Jake looked into her eyes, saw the steel beneath the silk, and made his choice. We ride. They mounted up and headed north, away from the spring, away from Cedar Ridge, away from everything they'd known. Jake led them along a narrow deer trail he'd discovered years ago, barely visible in the darkness. The horses picked their way carefully, trusting their riders as the ground rose toward the mountains. They'd been riding for an hour when they heard it, the distant sound of horses and men, voices carrying on the still night air. Jake had expected pursuit, but not this quickly. They must have had watchers at the ranch, he muttered, urging Dusty to a faster pace. The trail wound higher, through stands of juniper and pinon pine. Margaret followed Jake's lead, her months of training serving her well, but she could hear the pursuit gaining. Too many horses, too many men who knew this country. There! A shout from below. Someone had spotted their silhouettes against the stars. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness like deadly fireflies. Jake heard the whistle of bullets passing overhead, heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. You hit? No, keep going. They plunged down the far side of the ridge, horses sliding on loose shawl. Jake knew they couldn't outrun their pursuers, not with the whole town roused against them. They needed a defensible position. The box canyon, he called to Margaret. Follow me. He led them through a maze of rocks and narrow passages, the sounds of pursuit echoing off stone walls. Finally, they emerged into a small canyon with high walls on three sides, shelter, but also a potential trap. Get the horses back in that alcove, Jake ordered, already pulling his rifle from its scabbard. Keep them quiet. Margaret obeyed without question, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. When she returned, Jake had positioned himself behind a fallen boulder, rifle ready. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "You taught me." She drew the small revolver he'd given her weeks ago, during their lessons. "Though you said I'd never need it. I hoped you wouldn't." The first riders appeared at the canyon mouth, torches blazing. Jake recognized Chester Williams in the lead, his face twisted with righteous fury. Behind him came others, men from town. Some he knew, some he'd worked alongside. "Morrison," Mayor Sullivan's voice boomed across the canyon. "Send my daughter out and face justice like a man. She's here by choice." Jake called back. "Ask her yourself." "Margaret?" Her father's voice cracked slightly. "Please, daughter, come home. We can fix this. Send you to your aunt in Boston until the scandal dies down." Margaret stood, making herself visible despite Jake's hiss of protest. "I'm not going to Boston. Father, I'm not going anywhere without Jake. He's corrupted you." "No." Margaret's voice was clear and strong. "He's freed me. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing my own path." "Then you choose death," Chester Williams shouted. "Both of you." The attack came in a rush. Men spread out, seeking cover, firing up at their position. Jake returned fire methodically, not trying to kill but to keep them pinned. Margaret crouched beside him, reloading his rifle when needed, firing her revolver when anyone got too close. "We can't hold them forever," Jake said during a brief lull. "Too many of them? Then we make them pay for every inch," Margaret replied fiercely. The battle raged as the moon crossed the sky. Jake took a bullet in the shoulder, gritting his teeth against the pain. Margaret tore strips from her petticoat to bind the wound, her fingers slick with his blood. "You should have let me go alone," he gasped. "Stop saying that." She pressed the bandage tight. "We're in this together. Live together or die together." A sound above made them both look up. Men were working their way along the canyon rim, trying to get above them. Their position was about to become a death trap. "The cave," Jake said suddenly, remembering. "There's a cave system. Leads out the other side of the mountain. If we can reach it." They gathered what supplies they could carry, Jake gritting his teeth against the fire in his shoulder. Under cover of darkness, they crept along the canyon wall, using every shadow, every rocky outcrop. Shouts erupted as someone spotted movement, and gunfire resumed. They were almost to the cave mouth when Chester Williams emerged from behind a boulder, gun drawn. "Going somewhere?" Jake pushed Margaret behind him, raising his own weapon despite his wounded arm. The two men faced each other in the moonlight, fingers on triggers. "You always wanted her," Jake said quietly. "But she was never yours to want. And she's yours. A convict? A nobody? I'm the man she chose." Chester's face contorted with rage. He pulled the trigger just as Jake dove to the side, the bullet sparking off rock. Jake's return fire was true. Chester fell with a cry, clutching his leg. "Jake!" Margaret pulled him toward the cave as more men converged on their position. They plunged into darkness, feeling their way along stone walls as shouts echoed behind them. The cave system was a labyrinth, passages branching in all directions. Jake had explored parts of it years ago, but wounded and in darkness. Navigation was nearly impossible. They pressed on, choosing passages at random, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. Hours passed. The sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the drip of water and their own labored breathing. Finally, Jake collapsed against a wall, unable to go further. "Rest," Margaret said, though exhaustion weighted her own limbs. "Just for a moment?" She cradled his head in her lap, stroking his hair with trembling fingers. In the absolute darkness of the cave, she could pretend they were safe, that the world above didn't exist. "Margaret," Jake's voice was weak. "If I don't make it, you'll make it. Listen to me. If I don't, you find that spring. There's money hidden there, under the big rock shaped like a turtle. Enough to get you to California. Start over. Jake Morrison. You stop talking like that right now." Her tears fell on his face. "You promised your love would keep me alive. Well, my love is going to keep you alive too. We're getting out of this cave, we're getting to Mexico, and we're going to build a life together. Do you hear me? He reached up, finding her face in the darkness. I hear you. They rested until Jake could move again, then pressed on. Margaret supported him, their progress slow but steady. She talked to keep them both alert about their future ranch, the horses they'd raise, the children who'd run free under endless skies. Then, like a miracle, light, faint at first, then growing stronger, they emerged from the caves as dawn broke, painting the desert in shades of gold. They were on the far side of the mountain, miles from the canyon where they'd made their stand. But their relief was short-lived. In the distance, dust clouds marked riders fanning out across the desert. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. Jake leaned heavily on Margaret, blood seeping through his bandages. They had no horses, limited water, and miles of open desert between them and the Mexican border. Behind them, a town's worth of vengeance followed like wolves scenting wounded prey. Can you make it? Margaret asked, though she already knew his answer. With you beside me. Jake managed a ghost of his old grin. I can make it anywhere. They set off into the rising sun, two figures against the vastness of the desert. Every step was pain, every breath a victory. The mountains watched their slow progress with ancient indifference, keeping their secrets as they always had. Behind them, Cedar Ridge's finest citizens pursued their version of justice, convinced they were saving Margaret from herself, defending civilization against chaos. They couldn't understand that what they chased wasn't criminal or victim, but something far more dangerous to their ordered world. Two people who'd chosen love over law, passion over propriety, freedom over fear. As the sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace, Jake and Margaret pressed on. His blood marked their trail. Her determination carried them forward. In the crucible of pursuit and pain, their love was being forged into something unbreakable. They would reach Mexico or die trying, but they would not surrender. Not to the posse, not to society's judgment, not to the desert itself. Their secret love had been exposed. The town hunted them as predicted, but Jake's passion and Margaret's would keep them both alive. The desert stretched endlessly before them, brutal and beautiful and utterly indifferent to human notions of right and wrong. And somewhere in that vastness, sanctuary waited, if they could survive long enough to find it. The desert sun was merciless, turning the sand into a burning sheet that reflected heat in shimmering waves. Margaret's lips were cracked, her throat parched, but she didn't complain. Jake leaned heavily against her, his steps growing more unsteady with each passing hour. The bloodstain on his shoulder had spread, dark against the pale shirt. There, Jake rasped, pointing to a cluster of rocks ahead. Shade. They collapsed in the meager shadow of the boulders. Margaret immediately checking Jake's wound. The bullet had passed through, but the exertion and heat were taking their toll. She used the last of their water to clean it, trying not to show her fear at the angry red streaks spreading from the wound. Infection, Jake said, reading her face. I know. We need medicine, clean water, rest. What we need is distance. He struggled to sit up, scanning the horizon. They're still coming. Indeed, the dust clouds were closer now, perhaps 3 miles back. The posse had split into groups, spreading across the desert like a net. Margaret could make out individual riders when they crested the low hills. I know this area, Jake said suddenly. There's an old Apache camp, abandoned years ago. Spring there, some shelter, maybe 2 miles north. Can you make it? Have to. They set off again. Jake's arm around Margaret's shoulders, her arm around his waist. Each step was agony for him, each breath a battle. Margaret found herself praying, not the formal prayers of her childhood, but desperate pleas to any power that might be listening. The Apache camp was hidden in a canyon fold, invisible until they were almost upon it. Ancient stone circles marked where wickiups once stood, and miraculous. The spring still flowed, a trickle of clear water from the rocks. Margaret eased Jake down beside the spring, immediately cupping water to his lips. She drank deeply herself, then set about making him as comfortable as possible. Using her knife, she cut strips from her already torn petticoat for fresh bandages. "You're ruining your clothes," Jake murmured, attempting levity. "Good thing I never liked this dress anyway." As she worked, they heard horses approaching. Margaret grabbed Jake's rifle, checking the ammunition. Only a few rounds left. "Hide," Jake urged. "In the rocks. When they take me, you can—" "If you suggest I abandon you one more time, Jake Morrison, I'll shoot you myself." Despite everything, he smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The first riders appeared at the canyon entrance. 3 men, moving cautiously. Margaret recognized one as Tom Bradley, who ran the feed store. He'd always been kind to her, saving peppermint sticks for her when she was a child. "Mr. Bradley," she called out, rifle steady. "That's close enough." The men reined up, hands moving to weapons. "Miss Margaret," Bradley said, his voice carrying genuine sorrow. "Your pa's mighty worried. Half the town's out looking for you. I'm where I choose to be." "With him?" Bradley nodded toward Jake. "Miss Margaret, you don't know what you're doing. A man like that—" "A man like what?" Margaret's voice was steel. "Hard-working, honest, kind? Or do you just mean a man who made mistakes and paid for them?" "He's dying anyway," one of the other riders said coldly. "Can see it from here. Why throw your life away for a dead man?" Margaret fired, the bullet kicking up dust at the horse's feet. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider. "The next one won't miss," she said calmly. "Jake Morrison is under my protection. Anyone who wants him goes through me." "You've lost your mind, girl." The third rider spat. "No," Margaret replied. "I found it." The standoff stretched taut. Then Bradley slowly backed his horse away. "We'll be back with the others. Think hard about this. Miss Margaret, think about your family, your future." "I am thinking about my future," she said, "for the first time in my life." After they left, Jake's fever climbed rapidly. Margaret bathed his face with cool water, held him when chills racked his body, whispered encouragements when he cried out in delirium. As afternoon wore toward evening, she knew they couldn't wait for the posse's return. Jake needed help, or he would die. That's when she saw him, an old Apache man, standing at the canyon rim like a ghost from the past. Margaret's hand went to the rifle, then stopped. The man was unarmed, watching them with dark, unreadable eyes. "Please," Margaret called out in desperation. "He's dying." "Do you know medicine?" The old man studied them for a long moment, then began picking his way down the canyon wall with surprising agility. Up close, Margaret could see the years etched in his face, the wisdom in his bearing. He knelt beside Jake, examining the wound with gentle hands. Then he spoke. His English accented but clear. "The bullet poison spreads. Without medicine, he dies before sunrise. Can you help him?" "Why should I? White men killed my family, stole my land. Why save one who would do the same?" Margaret met his gaze directly. "Because he wouldn't. Because he's a good man who judges people by their actions, not their blood. Because—" Her voice broke. "Because I love him, and I'll do anything to save him." The Apache studied her, seeing something that made him nod slowly. "You have the spirit of the desert, strong, unbreaking." He stood. "I know plants that can help, but the town men come soon. Then we'd better hurry." While the old man gathered medicinal plants from hidden places in the canyon, Margaret kept watch. The sun was setting, painting the rocks in shades of blood and gold. In the distance, she could see the dust of many riders converging. The Apache returned with an armload of plants. Some Margaret recognized, others completely foreign. He built a small fire, brewing a pungent tea while crushing leaves into a poultice. "Hold him," he instructed. Margaret cradled Jake's head as the old man cleaned the wound with the tea. Jake cried out, back arching, but she held him steady. The poultice went on next, covered with clean cloth. "Make him drink." The Apache handed her a cup of bitter tea. "All of it, every hour until fever breaks." "Thank you," Margaret whispered. I don't even know your name. Joseph, the man said simply. My Christian name. My real name died with my people. He gathered his things. There is a hidden trail, north wall of canyon, leads to old silver mine. Abandoned, but deep. They will not find you there tonight. Why are you helping us? Joseph looked at Jake, then at Margaret. Long ago, a white man saved my grandson from drowning, asked for nothing in return, said all children deserve to live. He smiled sadly. That man looked like this one. Same eyes, same spirit. Perhaps it is the desert's way of balancing the scales. He left as mysteriously as he'd appeared, melting into the gathering darkness. Margaret followed his directions, half carrying, half dragging Jake to the hidden trail. It was treacherous in the dying light, but desperation gave her strength. The mine entrance was concealed behind a fall of rocks, the shaft extending back into absolute darkness. Margaret pulled Jake as far inside as she dared, then returned to sweep away their tracks with a branch. She could hear the posse now, horses neighing, men shouting. Chester Williams's voice rising above the rest despite his wounded leg. They were here. The spring's been used. Trail goes cold at the rocks, another voice reported. Like they vanished into thin air. They didn't vanish. Mayor Sullivan's voice, cold with determination. Spread out. Check every crevice, every shadow. They're here somewhere. Margaret held her breath, Jake's head in her lap. As boots crunched past the mine entrance, once, a man actually peered into the shadows where they hid, but the darkness was complete, and he moved on. Hours passed. The search moved to other parts of the canyon, voices growing distant. Margaret forced Jake to drink the medicinal tea, whispering prayers and promises and nonsense to fill the silence. His fever raged, then slowly, miraculously, began to break. Near midnight, Jake's eyes opened, focusing on her face in the dim starlight filtering into the mine. Margaret? His voice was weak but lucid. I'm here. Tears of relief streamed down her face. You're going to be all right. The posse? Still searching, but not close. We're hidden. Jake reached up, touching her face with trembling fingers. You saved me. We saved each other. They held each other in the darkness, listening to the desert night sounds, coyotes calling, wind sighing through stone, the distant voices of their hunters. Margaret told Jake about Joseph, about the medicine, about the standoff at the spring. You faced them down? Jake shook his head in wonder. Margaret Sullivan, you're a warrior. I'm a woman who protects what's hers, she corrected. And you, Jake Morrison, are mine. As dawn approached, the posse seemed to be pulling back, regrouping. Margaret knew they hadn't given up. They were likely planning a more systematic search come daylight. But for now, in this moment, she and Jake were alive and together. We'll need to move soon, Jake said, testing his strength by sitting up. The medicine had worked miracles, but he was still weak. Mexico's maybe 30 miles. If we can find horses, first, you rest, Margaret insisted. Drink more tea, get strong enough to ride, then we'll figure out the rest. Jake pulled her close, pressing his lips to her hair. Have I told you lately that I love you? Not since you were delirious with fever. Then I love you, Margaret, more than life, more than freedom, more than anything, and I love you. She whispered back, enough to fight the whole world if I have to. Outside, the desert was waking up, birds calling, small creatures stirring. Soon, their hunters would return. But Margaret felt no fear, only determination. They'd survived the night, survived the chase, survived everything thrown at them. Their love had indeed kept them alive, just as Jake had promised. Now they just had to stay alive long enough to reach freedom. The morning sun revealed their pursuers spread across the canyon like ants, methodically searching every crevice and shadow. From their hidden vantage point in the mine, Margaret counted at least 20 men. Her father stood at the center, directing the search with grim efficiency. They're not giving up, Jake observed, his voice stronger after a night of rest and medicine. Neither are we. Margaret checked their supplies. 2 bullets left, half a canteen of water, and the remainder of Joseph's medicinal tea. Can you walk? I can do whatever needs doing. They retreated deeper into the mine, following the shaft as it curved into the mountain. The air grew cooler, mustier, heavy with the ghosts of long-dead miners' dreams. Using matches sparingly, they navigated by touch and instinct. Listen, Jake whispered suddenly. Voices echoed from the mine entrance. Someone had finally discovered their hiding place. They're in here! Chester Williams's voice bounced off stone walls. Bring torches! Margaret and Jake pressed on, the tunnel branching into multiple passages. They chose blindly. Anything to put distance between them and their hunters. Behind them, boots thundered on stone, torchlight flickering like demon eyes in the darkness. The shaft they'd chosen ended abruptly in a pile of rubble, a cave-in from years past. Trapped. Back, Jake hissed, but lights were already visible in the tunnel behind them. Wait, Margaret felt along the walls, remembering something Joseph had said about the old mines. Her fingers found what she sought, a narrow crack in the wall, barely wide enough for a person. Through here! They squeezed through the gap just as Chester and 2 others rounded the corner. Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off stone where they'd been standing moments before. The crack led to another tunnel system, older. Partially natural caves expanded by native peoples long before any white man dreamed of silver. They stumbled through the darkness, following a faint movement of air that promised another exit. Behind them, Chester's cursing echoed off stone. He was too broad to fit through the crack, would have to find another way around. It bought them time, but not much. The tunnel opened suddenly onto a ledge halfway up a cliff face. Below stretched a narrow canyon, its floor 100 feet down. Above, the cliff continued another 50 feet to the rim. They were trapped between earth and sky. There! Jake pointed to a series of handholds carved into the rock face, ancient steps used by cliff dwellers centuries ago. We climb. Margaret looked at the dizzying drop, then at Jake's pale face, the fresh blood seeping through his bandages from their flight. You can barely stand. Then I'll crawl if I have to. He gripped her shoulders. Margaret, listen, if I fall, you won't fall. She positioned herself below him on the cliff face. Because I'll be right here to catch you. They began to climb, inch by tortuous inch. The ancient handholds were worn smooth by time, some crumbling under their weight. Jake's strength flagged quickly, his wounded shoulder barely able to support him. More than once, Margaret had to physically push him up to the next hold. Halfway up, shouts erupted from the tunnel they'd exited. Chester appeared on the ledge, raising his rifle. Got them! Margaret pressed herself against the cliff as a bullet whined past. Then Jake did something that stopped her heart. He let go with one hand, drew his revolver, and fired. His single shot was perfect, sending Chester diving back into the tunnel, but the effort cost him. His grip slipped, body swaying outward. Margaret lunged upward, catching his belt, holding him against the rock face with desperate strength she didn't know she possessed. Don't you dare, she gasped. Don't you dare leave me now. Jake's fingers found purchase again, and they continued their agonizing ascent. Below, men were pouring from the tunnel, but the angle made shooting difficult. Some began to climb after them, but they were heavier, clumsier, unprepared for the ancient route. Finally, blessedly, they reached the rim. Margaret hauled Jake over the edge, both collapsing in the dust, gasping like landed fish. But there was no time to rest. Riders were already spurring their horses along the canyon rim, trying to cut them off. That's when they saw them. 2 horses picketed in a grove of junipers, their riders presumably among those searching the tunnels below. Margaret didn't hesitate. They needed those horses. They mounted up, Jake swaying but determined. As they wheeled the horses south toward Mexico, Mayor Sullivan himself crested the rise ahead of them, backed by 5 men. Margaret, stop this madness, her father shouted. You're my daughter. I was never your daughter, Margaret shot back. I was your possession, your political pawn, your path to respectability. But I was never allowed to be myself. I forbid. You have no power over me anymore. Father, I'm not the obedient little girl you tried to create. I'm a woman who chooses her own path. Jake straightened in his saddle, hand on his gun. Let us pass. Sullivan, we want no more bloodshed. You've taken everything from me. The mayor snarled. My reputation, my standing, my daughter. I took nothing, Jake interrupted. Margaret chose, that's what you can't forgive, that she chose someone like me over the life you planned for her. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Then one of the mayor's men, old Jim, who'd worked at the Sullivan house for years, slowly moved his horse aside. Jim, what are you doing? Sullivan demanded. Letting them go, sir. The old man's voice was tired. Been chasing them all night, seen how they fight for each other. That kind of love. Well, maybe it's worth more than what we call respectability. Traitor! But Jim's defection sparked something. Another man moved aside, then another. Soon, only Sullivan and Chester, who'd climbed up from the canyon, remained blocking their path. You do this, Sullivan said, his voice deadly quiet. And you're dead to me, both of you. Margaret met her father's eyes one last time. Then mourn me if you must, but I'll be living my life, not the one you chose for me. She and Jake spurred their horses forward. For a moment, it seemed Sullivan would shoot, his hand white-knuckled on his pistol. Then Chester made the decision for him. Raising his rifle, Jake was faster. His shot sent Chester's rifle spinning away. The deputy fell to his knees, clutching his hand, screaming curses. They galloped past, Sullivan making no move to stop them. As they rode, Margaret looked back once to see her father still sitting his horse, a broken man watching his world ride away. They pushed the horses hard, knowing pursuit would resume once shock wore off. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace once more. Jake swayed in his saddle, face gray with pain and exhaustion, but he stayed mounted through sheer will. By noon, they could see it, a line of green marking the river that formed the border. Mexico lay just beyond, promising sanctuary, a new life, freedom from the past. But between them and salvation stretched 5 miles of open desert, and behind them, dust clouds marked renewed pursuit. The final race had begun. Can you make it? Margaret asked. Jake's smile was fierce through his pain. Try and stop me. They rode like the wind itself, horses' hooves thundering across the hardpan. Behind them, the posse spread out, trying to cut off their escape routes. Gunfire crackled, bullets singing past. But at full gallop, accuracy was impossible. 4 miles to freedom. 3, 2. Jake's horse stumbled. Nearly going down, he saved it, but the animal was blown, foam-flecked, finished. Margaret immediately reined in. Take mine, she said, dismounting. No, Jake Morrison, for once in your life, stop arguing and do as I say. They switched mounts quickly. Jake on the fresher horse, Margaret on the exhausted one. Together they pressed on, though her mount was clearly failing. 1 mile. The river was visible now, cottonwoods marking its course. Behind them, the fastest riders were gaining. Margaret's horse was barely cantering, each stride a struggle. Then Jake did something that made her heart soar. He wheeled his mount around, charging back toward her, leaning from his saddle like a trick rider. He swept her up behind him, abandoning the spent horse. Together, he shouted over the wind. We go together or not at all. They raced for the river, one horse carrying 2 hearts. The posse was close enough now that Margaret could see individual faces, her father among them, his expression unreadable. The riverbank appeared suddenly, a 6-foot drop to the water. Without hesitation, Jake spurred the horse over the edge. They hit the water with a tremendous splash, the current immediately pulling at them. The horse swam strongly, carrying them toward the far shore, toward Mexico, toward freedom. Shots rang out from the bank behind them, but the river was wide. the current swift. Margaret held tight to Jake, feeling his heart beat against her arms, knowing they'd made it. They emerged dripping on the Mexican shore just as the posse reached the opposite bank. For a long moment, pursuers and pursued regarded each other across the international boundary that neither side could cross. Margaret saw her father dismount, standing at the water's edge. Even at this distance, she could see the defeat in his posture. Chester raged beside him, but Sullivan seemed to have aged a decade in a single night. "Goodbye, father," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear. Then she and Jake turned their mount south, toward the dusty Mexican town visible in the distance, toward a life they'd choose for themselves, toward a love that had survived everything Cedar Ridge could throw at it. Behind them, the Rio Grande flowed on, indifferent to human drama, marking the line between past and future, between who they'd been and who they'd become. They'd made it, against all odds, through pain and pursuit and the fury of those who'd never understand. They'd made it. Their secret love had been exposed. The town had hunted them as predicted, but their passion, their choice to fight for each other, had kept them both alive, as they rode toward their new life. Jake reached back to take Margaret's hand, their fingers interlacing like their fates. "No regrets?" he asked. "Not one," she replied. "Not a single one." The Mexican sun welcomed them like a blessing. And somewhere behind them, Cedar Ridge faced the dawning realization that perhaps it was not the lovers who were lost, but those who'd tried to cage them. The cantina in Villa Esperanza was dim and cool, a blessed relief from the Mexican sun. Jake slumped at a corner table, the fever returning despite Joseph's medicine. Margaret pressed a cup of water to his lips, worry etching lines around her eyes. "We need a doctor," she said to the proprietor in halting Spanish. "Sí, señora. Dr. Morales, 2 streets over, but—" The man's eyes flicked to their disheveled appearance, their obvious status as fugitives. "He asks questions sometimes." Margaret placed one of her mother's gold earrings on the bar. She'd sewn them into her petticoat months ago, a precaution that now proved wise. "No questions." The doctor, an elderly man with kind eyes, treated Jake's wound properly, cleaning and stitching it while muttering about foolish gringos and desert journeys. He prescribed rest, medicine, and time, luxuries they weren't sure they could afford. They found lodging in a small adobe house on the town's edge, paying a week in advance with another piece of Margaret's hidden jewelry, as Jake slept, fighting infection and exhaustion. Margaret sat by the window, watching the road north. On the 3rd day, a lone rider appeared, not from the north, but from the east. Margaret tensed, hand going to the revolver at her side, then relaxed as she recognized the weathered face. Old Pete from the Broken Spur Ranch dismounted stiffly, looking around before approaching their door. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "Jake here?" "Pete?" Jake's voice came from the bed, weak but alert. "What are you doing here?" The old foreman entered, his face grave. "Brought the news. Thought you should know what's happening back home." Margaret poured him water as he settled into a chair. "The town's split right down the middle," Pete began, half still calling for blood, the other half saying maybe they were too hasty. "That old Apache, Joseph, he came into town the day after you left, told everyone how you two acted, how Miss Margaret here fought to save Jake, made some folks think." "My parents?" Margaret asked quietly. Pete's weathered face softened. "Your ma took to her bed. Won't speak to anyone. Your PA." He paused. "He's a changed man. Still mayor, but the fire's gone out of him. Spends most nights in his study, staring at that portrait of you as a girl." Margaret turned to the window, hiding the tears that threatened. Despite everything, they were still her parents. "There's more," Pete continued. "Chester Williams, he's stirring up trouble. Says he's forming a group to come after you, law or no law. But Sheriff Daniels told him flat out, anyone crosses that border hunting you two will answer to him. International incident and all. Why did you come?" "Pete?" Jake asked. "Risky, being seen with us." The old man smiled. "Been thinking about what you said once. about second chances. Man deserves that. If he's earned it, you earned it, son. And Miss Margaret here, she's got more courage than half the men I've known." He reached into his coat, pulling out a leather pouch. Ranch hands took up a collection. Not much, but might help you get started. Margaret's tears flowed freely now. "Pete, we can't." "You can, and you will," Pete said firmly. "Also brought this." He handed Jake a letter. "From someone who wants to remain nameless, but said you'd know who." Jake opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, in shaky handwriting, "A mother understands love. Be happy. Live free." It was unsigned, but Margaret recognized her mother's hand. "She sent something else," Pete added, producing a small daguerreotype. Margaret gasped. It was her parents' wedding portrait. Her mother young and radiant. Her father handsome and proud. On the back, in her mother's writing, "Love changes everything." They talked through the evening, Pete sharing news of friends who sent good wishes, of the ranch continuing despite the scandal, of a town slowly questioning its rigid morality. As night fell, he prepared to leave. "Where will you go?" he asked. Jake and Margaret exchanged glances. They'd been discussing this very question. "South," Jake said. "Maybe to the coast. Buy a small ranch, raise horses, live quiet." "Living loud got us into enough trouble," Margaret added with a small smile. Pete nodded approvingly. "Got something else. From a friend." He led them outside to where 3 horses stood, their own mounts from the flight, plus a pack horse laden with supplies. "That Apache, Joseph?" "He brought them to the ranch, said you'd need them. Also said to tell you the desert remembers its children." After Pete left, vanishing into the Mexican night, Jake and Margaret stood together in the doorway of their temporary home. Jake's arm was around her waist, her head on his shoulder. "We could go back," Margaret said suddenly. "In a few years, when tempers cool, face whatever comes." "Is that what you want?" She considered, then shook her head. "No, I want to go forward, not back, build something new. Then that's what we'll do." As Jake's strength returned over the following days, they made plans. The money from the ranch hands, combined with what Margaret's jewelry would bring, could buy them a start somewhere. They heard of opportunities in Mazatlan, where Americans were welcome and the past mattered less than the present. But first, Jake had something to do. On their last night in Villa Esperanza, he led Margaret to the small church at the town's heart. The priest, Father Miguel, was expecting them. "Margaret Sullivan," Jake said, taking both her hands as they stood before the altar. "You gave up everything for me, your family, your position, your whole world. I have nothing to offer but my love, my labor, and my life. But if you'll have me—" "Yes," Margaret interrupted, laughing through her tears. "Yes, you impossible man. I'll marry you in this dusty church in this foreign land, and I'll count myself the luckiest woman alive." The ceremony was simple. Pete had delayed his departure to stand as witness, along with Dr. Morales and his wife. No white dress, no flowers, no guests filling pews, just 2 people promising to love, honor, and cherish, having already proven those vows in blood and sacrifice. As Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, the church bells rang out across Villa Esperanza. In that moment, Margaret thought of her mother, wondering if she could hear those bells somehow, across all the miles and heartbreak. They emerged from the church to find a small crowd gathered. Word had spread of the American lovers who'd defied a whole town for their love. Someone started playing a guitar. Others joined with violins. And suddenly there was music, dancing, celebration. The people of Villa Esperanza, who knew about love and loss and the courage to choose your own path, welcomed them as their own. "No regrets?" Jake asked as they danced in the dusty plaza, his wound still tender but his spirits soaring. "One," Margaret admitted. When he looked concerned, she smiled. "I regret it took us so long to find each other." They left Villa Esperanza 3 days later, heading south toward the sea and whatever future awaited. As their horses carried them through the morning light, Margaret turned for one last look north, toward the country they'd left behind. Somewhere beyond those mountains, Cedar Ridge was waking to another day. Her father would be in his study, her mother in her garden. Chester would be nursing his grudges. The good people of the town would be going about their lives, secure in their certainties. But here, on this dusty Mexican road, two souls rode free. They'd paid for their freedom in blood and tears, in everything they'd left behind. But as Margaret felt the sun on her face and Jake's presence beside her, she knew the price had been worth it. Their secret love exposed, the town hunted them while his passion kept her alive. She murmured, remembering Jake's words from months ago. Our passion, Jake corrected, reaching over to take her hand. Our love kept us both alive. They rode on, into their new life, into their chosen future. Behind them, their past grew smaller with each mile, until it was just a memory, a story to tell their children someday. Ahead, the horizon stretched endless and full of promise. In the end, they discovered a truth as old as the desert itself. Love, real love, cannot be contained by conventions or borders or the disapproval of others. It flows like water, finding its way through every obstacle, carving its own path through the hardest stone. And in a small church in Villa Esperanza, the record book showed a simple entry: Jake Morrison and Margaret Sullivan, united in holy matrimony, witnessed by those who understand that love is its own law, its own country, its own home. Their secret was secret no more. It had transformed into something else entirely, a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, passion over propriety, freedom over the familiar. And in that choice, they'd found not just each other, but themselves. The road south stretched before them, dusty and uncertain and absolutely perfect. 5 years had passed since that desperate flight across the desert. The small ranch outside Mazatlan had grown from a run-down collection of adobe buildings into a thriving horse-breeding operation. Jake stood at the corral fence, watching a magnificent black stallion with a white star on its forehead, descendant of the wild mustangs they'd captured in the mountains. "Papa, Papa!" a small voice called out. 4-year-old Thomas came running, his mother's green eyes shining in his sun-bronzed face. "Mama says come quick, visitors!" Jake scooped up his son, settling him on his shoulders as they walked toward the house. Margaret stood on the porch, no longer the porcelain doll of Cedar Ridge, but a woman of the frontier, strong and capable and more beautiful than ever. In her arms, baby Sarah dozed peacefully, but it was the figures beside her that made Jake stop short. Mayor Sullivan stood awkwardly in his traveling clothes, older, grayer, diminished. Beside him, Margaret's mother clutched a handkerchief, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, Jake?" Sullivan said quietly. For a moment, no one moved. Then Margaret stepped forward. "Father, Mother, welcome to our home." The reunion was tentative at first, years of hurt and anger creating walls between them. But Thomas, with a child's innocent directness, broke the tension. "Are you my grandpapa?" he asked Sullivan, studying him with serious eyes. Sullivan's composure cracked. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I am." Over dinner, the story emerged. Chester Williams had finally gone too far, his obsession leading him to violence against those who'd shown sympathy for Jake and Margaret. He'd been arrested, tried, and sent to prison. Ironically, the same one where Jake had served his time. The town saw him for what he was. Mrs. Sullivan said, a bitter, jealous man who couldn't accept that Margaret had chosen her own path. It made people think, made us think. "Your mother began writing to old friends," Sullivan continued, "tracking your path south. When we heard you'd settled here, built this life," he gestured around the comfortable home, the evidence of prosperity and happiness, "we knew we had to come." "To drag us back?" Margaret asked, old defenses rising. "No," her mother said firmly. "To apologize, to know our grandchildren, to be a family again, if you'll have us." Jake watched Margaret wrestle with years of hurt, saw the moment she chose forgiveness. "We'll see," she said carefully. Trust takes time to rebuild. Over the following days, bridges slowly mended. Sullivan, stripped of his mayoral arrogance, proved surprisingly good with horses. Helping Jake with the spring branding, Mrs. Sullivan taught Margaret Eastern recipes adapted to Mexican ingredients, the two women finding common ground in motherhood. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the ocean gold, Sullivan spoke the words he'd traveled 2,000 miles to say. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I thought I knew what was best for you, thought position and wealth mattered more than happiness. But watching you here, seeing what you've built together, you were right to run, right to choose love." Margaret took her father's weathered hand. "We all made choices. Father, the important thing is we can make new ones now. There's something else," Mrs. Sullivan added. "The town. Cedar Ridge has changed. Your story. It's become something of a legend. The mayor's daughter who chose love over position. The reformed outlaw who risked everything for his beloved. Some of the young people, they see you as heroes." Jake laughed, genuinely amused. "Heroes? We were just two people who fell in love. Sometime," Sullivan said. "That's the most heroic thing of all." They stayed 2 weeks, those grandparents who'd traveled so far to reclaim their family. When they prepared to leave, promises were made. Letters, perhaps visits. A future where the past no longer cast such dark shadows. As their carriage pulled away, Thomas waving enthusiastically from Jake's shoulders, Margaret leaned into her husband's side. "Did you ever think we'd see this day?" she asked. "Honestly? No, but then I never thought a proper Eastern lady would save my life in a desert canyon either." "I was never that proper," Margaret protested. "Thank God for that." That night, they received other visitors, a weathered Apache man and old Pete, who'd made the long journey together. "Joseph," Jake said warmly, clasping the old man's hand. "What brings you here?" "Came to see if the desert children thrived," Joseph said, his dark eyes taking in the prosperity around them. "I see they have." Pete had news from Cedar Ridge, the town continuing its slow evolution. People beginning to question the rigid rules that had driven out 2 of their own. "Sheriff Daniels retired," he reported. But before he did, he had Jake's record cleared. Said a man who'd risked his life protecting the woman he loved had proven his rehabilitation better than any prison term. They talked long into the night, sharing stories and memories. As his guests prepared to leave, Joseph pulled Jake aside. "The spirits told me something," he said quietly. "Your children will bridge 2 worlds, heal old wounds. The boy especially. He has the gift of bringing people together." Jake thought of how Thomas had melted his grandfather's stern facade and nodded. He gets that from his mother. After their guests departed, Jake and Margaret walked down to the beach, leaving the children with their trusted housekeeper. The moon laid a silver path across the water, and the waves whispered secrets to the shore. "Do you ever miss it?" Margaret asked. "Arizona, the desert." "Sometimes," Jake admitted. "But home isn't a place, it's—" He pulled her close. "It's wherever you are." They stood in comfortable silence, remembering their desperate flight, the price of their freedom, the love that had sustained them through everything. "I've been thinking," Margaret said eventually, "about what my father said, about our story inspiring others. Maybe we should write it down. For Thomas and Sarah, so they know where they came from. For others who might need to know that love is worth fighting for. Their secret love exposed. The town hunted them while his passion kept her alive." Jake quoted with a smile. "It would make quite a tale. Our tale," Margaret corrected. "Our truth." As they walked back to their home, their children, their chosen life, Jake reflected on the strange paths that had brought them here. From that first meeting at the moonlit spring to this beach in Mexico, every moment had been worth it. They'd lost a town, but gained a world. They'd fled as outlaws, but lived as free souls. They'd been hunted for their love, but had emerged victorious, not through violence, but through the simple act of refusing to let go of each other. Back at the house, they found Thomas trying to stay awake, fighting sleep to hear one more story about wild horses and desert adventures. As Margaret tucked him in, he asked sleepily, "Mama, will I find someone to love like you love Papa?" "If you're very lucky," she said, kissing his forehead, "and if you're brave enough to choose love over everything else." Later, as Jake and Margaret prepared for bed in their room overlooking the sea, he pulled her into his arms one more time. "Any regrets now?" he asked, echoing their old ritual. "None," she said firmly. "Not one. We chose each other. Jake Morrison. And that choice made all the difference. Even when the whole town came after us? Especially then. That's when I knew for certain. You were worth any price, any sacrifice, any scandal." They settled into bed, two hearts that had found each other across impossible odds. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, marking time in waves rather than minutes. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, a spring still bubbled beside ancient cottonwoods, keeping the secret of where it all began. Their love had indeed kept them alive, through pursuit and pain, exile and reconciliation. It had transformed from a secret whispered by moonlight into a legacy written in the lives of their children, in the forgiveness of family, in the proof that sometimes the greatest rebellion is simply choosing to love without permission, as sleep claimed them. Jake's last thought was of that long-ago promise. His passion would keep her alive. He smiled in the darkness, amending it. Their passion had kept them both alive, and more than alive, it had let them truly live. The legend of the mayor's daughter and the reformed outlaw would be told in Cedar Ridge for generations, growing with each telling. But here in this house by the sea, it was simply their story, a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, forever and always. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. If you enjoyed this story of forbidden love and the courage to choose your own path, please share where you're listening from. It's always wonderful to know where in the world these frontier stories are reaching. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Jake and Margaret's journey. Did their love inspire you? What would you have done in their place? Your comments and stories make our community richer. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your own horizons.